Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the Roman Empire in Part 2, beginning with the controversial reign of Caligula, Rome's youngest emperor, and gently arriving at the artistic yet troubled era of Nero, whose reign would end the Julio-Claudian dynasty forever. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which Roman emperor's story you find most intriguing, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of ancient Roman voices to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Caligula, later known as Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, entered this world on August 31st, 12 AD, in the Italian town of Antium. His father, Germanicus, was born in 15 BC and was the nephew of the future Emperor Tiberius. He rose to command the legions in Germany and held the consulship twice. He was popular with the soldiers and people of Rome alike and was brought into the line of succession at Augustus's request through his adoption by Tiberius. Following his campaigns in Germany, Germanicus was sent to the east by Tiberius, where he later died in 19 AD. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was born in 14 BC and was the daughter of Julia and her second husband, Agrippa, and granddaughter of Augustus. She married Germanicus, and they had 9 children. 2 died in infancy and 1 in early childhood. In the end, only 4 of her children would outlive her. Like her husband, she was popular with the troops and with the people of Rome, which caused an ever-widening rift between her and Tiberius, until she was eventually exiled in 29 AD, and subsequently starved to death in 33 AD. Born as Gaius, Caligula spent his first years in Italy, spending some of the time within Augustus's household. When Germanicus left for Germany in 13 AD and was joined by Agrippina, Gaius was sent to join them by Augustus in 14 AD. Beginning the journey in May, he quickly became favored by the legions, and they nicknamed him Caligula, or Little Boots, owing to the soldiers' boots he wore as part of his miniature legionary uniform that his mother dressed him in. For his part, Caligula is said to have helped put down the mutiny among the legions in 14 AD. When Agrippina was instructed to carry him to safety to a nearby tribal settlement, it shamed the soldiers, and peace was restored. The soldiers asked that both Agrippina and Caligula return to camp. Germanicus agreed that Caligula could return, but his mother would remain absent for the remainder of her current pregnancy. Caligula likely remained in the camp until Germanicus returned to Rome in 17 AD, where he celebrated a triumph, and Caligula rode in his father's chariot during the procession along with his 4 siblings. When Germanicus was appointed to command in the east, Agrippina and Caligula accompanied him. The journey led them through the provinces, where they were received warmly, their progress resembling a triumphal procession. Arriving in Assos, in modern-day Turkey, in 18 AD, Caligula, at only 5 years old, was said to have made his first speech. It is likely that when Germanicus visited Egypt in 19 AD, Caligula accompanied his parents. When Germanicus died later that year on their return, Caligula was part of the procession alongside his mother that brought Germanicus's ashes back to Rome, arriving in Italy in 20 AD. Little of his education or other matters pertaining to Caligula's early years is known. It is likely that his education would have followed that of other children of the senatorial class. While his brothers, Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar, assumed their places within the succession at this point in time, it seems that Caligula didn't figure into Tiberius's plan. It was during these intervening years that Sejanus rose to power, favored by Tiberius. Relations between Agrippina and the emperor continued to sour, and following the death of Tiberius's son, Drusus the Younger, in 23 AD, his suspicion of her and those around her grew. In 27 AD, Tiberius had grown so suspicious of both Agrippina and her eldest son, Nero Caesar, no doubt fueled by the maneuvers of Sejanus, that they were both placed under house arrest, which led to Caligula and 2 of his sisters, Drusilla and Livilla, being moved to live in their great-grandmother, Olivia's, household. His other sister, Agrippina the Younger, was betrothed by Tiberius to Domitius Ahenobarbus shortly after in 28 AD. During one of Tiberius's returns to the mainland following his retirement from Rome, when Olivia died in 29 AD, it was Caligula who delivered her funeral oration. Following Livia's death, Caligula and his sisters were taken into the household of his grandmother Antonia, the daughter of Mark Antony. Antonia was well connected throughout the eastern provinces, and it was while staying with her that Caligula began his lasting friendships with three princes of Thrace. It has been posited that it was whilst living with his grandmother that his incest with Drusilla began. However, modern interpretations of the evidence now suggest that while Caligula was close to his sister, the charge of incest amounts to little more than slander. How much contact Caligula had with his mother and brothers in the previous 2 years is unknown. However, at the same time that they were brought into Antonia's household, Tiberius had both Caligula's mother and elder brother Nero Caesar exiled, and the following year saw the imprisonment of his brother Drusus Caesar, with the machinations of Sejanus in full swing. By 30 AD, Antonia wrote to Tiberius. Although the contents of the letter are unknown, it seems to have had an effect on Tiberius, and towards the end of the year, he summoned Caligula to Capri, the island he'd retired to some years earlier. Later than usual, at 18 years old, Caligula assumed the toga virilis, but without the honors that many of his predecessors had enjoyed on their assumption. It may also have been at this point that Tiberius began to turn against Sejanus, and the possibility that Caligula may have become the next target of his schemes against Germanicus's family is not out of the question. However, it has also been suggested that, in essence, Caligula, given his popularity as a son of Germanicus, was to serve as something of a hostage to ensure he couldn't be used against Tiberius, perhaps even providing a stabilizing effect for Tiberius's position, given the bad feeling directed towards those who were perceived as complicit in the downfall of Germanicus's family. Early in 31 AD, Caligula was granted a priesthood on the recommendation of Tiberius. It is not known for sure what Caligula felt in 33 AD when his brother, Joseph Caesar, was starved to death, followed shortly thereafter by the death of his mother. Whatever he felt, he kept to his own counsel and didn't allow himself to be drawn into making complaints or speaking out against Tiberius. In fact, it has been suggested that, given the emperor's feelings toward the other members of the family, Caligula adapted his behavior depending on the situation to avoid invoking the anger of Tiberius. Evidently, Caligula succeeded in his attempt to keep himself on Tiberius's good side, and although he cannot be said to have won Tiberius's affection, neither did he do anything to provoke suspicion. In the same year as the deaths of his brother and mother, Caligula held his first public office as quaestor when he was still below the required minimum age, and was granted the concession to hold offices 5 years before meeting the age requirements. Although suggested for the position of augur, he was instead promoted to the higher priestly college of the pontiffs. Later that year, Tiberius arranged his marriage to Julio-Claudian at Antium, but the marriage didn't last as she died in childbirth. The following year, following the death of his first wife, Caligula possibly became involved in an affair with Ennia, the wife of the prefect Macro. The primary accounts differ in their explanations of how the affair began, but each paints a picture of the character of Caligula that is typically known today. However, once again, some modern re-examinations of the evidence suggest that while both Macro and Ennia were initially favored by Caligula and played their part in helping to secure his future succession, it is unlikely that an actual affair took place. By 35 AD, the succession had not been settled by Tiberius, who was by now in his mid-70s. It was in this year that he composed his will, but did not definitively set out who was to succeed him. Instead, it seems the matter was left open as he equally divided the imperial assets between his grandson Gemellus and Caligula. Many historians have suggested that this signaled Tiberius's wish that they become the joint heirs, but as neither contender was officially designated as the next emperor, it is likely that Tiberius was somewhat conflicted with the choice. Tacitus's accounts that the emperor could not summon the strength to make a decision are the most plausible. It has also been suggested that Tiberius feared for the safety of Gemellus at the hands of Caligula, which may have hindered him in making a final decision. It was in 36 AD that Caligula came into contact with Julius Agrippa, sometimes known as Herod Agrippa, grandson of Herod the Great, who received permission to visit Capri from Tiberius. Agrippa was supposed to have become a companion for Gemellus, but instead sought favor with Caligula. He flattered Caligula, extolling that he would make a better emperor than Tiberius. And when his words were later reported to Tiberius, he was arrested. Caligula, however, faced no repercussions. By the time Tiberius died in March 37 AD in Mycenae, the question of the succession was still open. Once again, the primary accounts of Caligula differ, but all suggest that he played a role in the emperor's death alongside the Praetorian prefect Macro, although none of the claims can be substantiated. Whatever his involvement or lack thereof, the Praetorians took matters into their own hands and proclaimed Caligula imperator on the same day that Tiberius died. 2 days later, when the Senate declared their own allegiance to Caligula, they declared Tiberius's will null and void due to the uncertain state of the deceased emperor's mind. Even before reaching the city, word was sent by Caligula that Julius Agrippa should be released from imprisonment into house arrest. Caligula accompanied the body back to Rome, arriving almost 2 weeks after the death at the end of March, where he was greeted by joyous crowds. The Senate then officially conferred the power of the Principate to Caligula, which he accepted, only refusing the title of Pater Patri, which he would accept later in the year. Caligula was now emperor at just 24, and while as a son of Germanicus, he held the popularity of the people, unlike those who would otherwise have succeeded Tiberius. He had no preparation for the position in either governing or military command. Despite the Senate declaring Tiberius's will as null and void, one of Caligula's first acts as emperor saw him announce that he would honor the bequests of payment that Tiberius had made to the people and army. However, despite communicating with the Senate before his arrival in Rome, asking that Tiberius be deified, the motion was rejected, and Caligula didn't pursue it. He also pronounced an end to the Maestas trials, that is, those trials dealing with claims against the Roman state, people, or emperor, which had plagued the last years of Tiberius's reign, proclaiming that any exiled or imprisoned victims of the trials would be given their freedom and all the documents pertaining to the trials would be publicly burned. He also promised to work with the Senate. By this point, Livilla had been dead for 9 years, and only now were her bequests granted, by the new emperor having been refused by Tiberius. Caligula also added some of his own grants, which added to the wealth bestowed upon the Praetorians and people of Rome, renewed the games, which had been few and far between, and recalled the actors who had been banished from Rome under Tiberius. Soon after, he delivered the oration at Tiberius's funeral, but said very little about the deceased emperor. However, early on, he still had to deal with the Parthians, who had been causing trouble in the east in the last years of Tiberius's reign. The Parthians had been stopped in their advance by the Syrian governor Vitellius, who had been instructed by Tiberius to make peace with them while still keeping a pro-Roman ruler on the throne of Armenia. This has been a source of contention for the Parthians. The candidate for ruler under Tiberius Mithridates was recalled by Caligula to Rome and imprisoned. By not installing his own ruler, he made a concession to peace with the Parthians, although it went against the Augustan policy. Caligula also set out to honor his family members and travel to the islands where his mother and eldest brother had died. He gathered their remains with his own hands and returned them to Rome via Ostia, where they were carried through the crowded city to Augustus's mausoleum and interred within. The procession took on the style of a triumph. A raft of honors followed for members of his family. September was renamed after Germanicus. Coins were minted to honor his brothers Nero and Drusus, and statues of them were displayed in the city. He also laid out a decree that an image of his mother, Agrippina, would accompany future processions and funeral sacrifices, and that games in her honor would take place each year. He then turned to the remaining living members of the family. Antonia was granted the title of Augusta, the same title Olivia had borne during her life. His 3 sisters were made honorary Vestal virgins, although without the requirement of chastity. They were also to be included in the oath of allegiance, sworn to the emperor, and were to be allowed to sit in the emperor's box during games at the circus. To his uncle Claudius, he allowed him to take his first steps into political life, which Tiberius had refused. When he was designated to serve as Caligula's colleague as consul, he then adopted Gemellus, allowing him to assume the toga virilis, and granted him the title of Princeps Juventutis, effectively making him Caligula's heir. But he went further still, forbidding all honors for himself, including the displaying of statues in his image within the city. It was around this time that Julius Agrippa was formally released by Caligula and was rewarded by being granted part of his grandfather Herod's territory, comprising Trachonitis, Golonitis, and Britannia, that had been under the purview of the governor of Syria since the death of the tetrarch Philip a few years earlier. Agrippa was named as king, and the funds that had been kept aside from the territories under Tiberius were granted to him. There is some suggestion that he may also have received the territory of Abilene at this time. Another friend of the emperor, Antiochus, had his father's territory of Commagene returned to him, which had been brought into the empire as a province by Tiberius. Caligula took up his first consulship on July 1st, 37 AD, thereby allowing the previous consuls to serve their full term. When he assumed the office, he gave a speech in the Senate criticizing and announcing Tiberius's actions. He also made changes to the way he would be formally greeted in public, dispensing with the customary greeting. The consulship lasted just a couple of months, but during this time, Caligula dedicated the Temple of Augustus, of which construction had begun during Tiberius's reign. To celebrate the dedication, a great banquet and lavish games were held. Approximately 800 animals were killed in the arena for the entertainment of the people. There were also chariot races, and Caligula himself appeared driving a triumphal chariot. Both he and Claudius held the consulship for only 2 months before resigning to allow those next designated for the position to take up the role for the remainder of the year. Despite lacking the experience and age of his predecessors, Caligula performed the role of emperor well in the early months, ingratiating himself with the wealthy and plebeian classes alike. However, his success cannot all be attributed to himself, for Macro and his former father-in-law Silanus seem to have been instrumental in guiding him, seeming to strengthen their own positions within his regime. But soon after resigning the consulship, disaster struck, and Caligula fell ill sometime around September or October 37th AD. He came close to death. However, it is unknown what afflicted him. The people of Rome were said to be grieved by the news, and nightly gatherings around the Palatine were observed. Caligula had no children, but had adopted Gemellus, and so Macro and Silanus, in an attempt to avert a succession crisis, began to make moves to ensure that should the emperor die, Gemellus would succeed him. But it seems that Caligula had other ideas. It has long been asserted that, of his 3 sisters, it was Drusilla whom Caligula favored the most, and had grown close to her second husband, Aemilius Lepidus. While still sick, he chose Drusilla to inherit, and while a woman couldn't succeed him, her husband could. Caligula recovered, and immediately set out to remove Gemellus, who was accused of plotting against the emperor. Gemellus was forced to commit suicide, but not before being instructed on how to do it by the soldiers sent to see it done. Another incident that took place shortly after his recovery tells of his attitude towards would-be flatterers when he ordered 2 men who had sworn oaths for his recovery to carry out their words. One had offered his own death in place of Caligula's. The other had sworn to fight as a gladiator if the emperor recovered. There is some disagreement, however, whether the 2 men actually died or were merely subjected to the humiliations of their intended ordeals. There is some dispute on the exact sequence, but shortly after Caligula recovered, Silanus fell from his favor. His right to vote in the Senate was first rescinded when Caligula changed the procedure, and there is some suggestion that Silanus remaining in Rome while Caligula traveled to recover his family's remains aroused his suspicions, thinking that Silanus wished to take over should the emperor not return from the sea voyage. Whatever the true cause of his fall, Silanus took matters into his own hands and committed suicide. Then, early in 38 AD, Caligula moved against Macro. He was appointed as the prefect of Egypt and was replaced as praetorian prefect by 2 men, instead of 1, of whom only Marcus Aracinus Clemens is named, as Augustus had done during his reign. But Macro never made it to Egypt, and it has been suggested by one historian that the appointment was merely a deception similar to that which Tiberius had engineered against Sejanus. The primary source is a text that charges were laid against Macro and his wife Ennia, and they both committed suicide. It was in the midst of these first deaths that Caligula remarried late in 37 AD to Livia or Astilla, who was already engaged at the time. But like his first marriage, it didn't last. When they divorced a short time later, Livia was banished from Rome, sometime following the divorce, although the date is uncertain. For the moment, the business of ruling the empire continued as normal. The New Year oaths were sworn in 38 AD, but Tiberius's decrees were excluded, and his ban on historical writings was rescinded by Caligula. He also took the step of publishing the empire's accounts, which had been suppressed during Tiberius's reign. He made changes within the justice system, adding a fifth panel of senatorial judges to hear cases and reducing the number he would hear himself. Caligula also made reforms within the equestrian class, allowing new members to be admitted, including men from among the provinces, since reductions made during Tiberius's reign had put a stop to new entrants. Those deemed suitable could advance, further still to hold a position in the Senate. But Caligula went further still, abolishing the sales tax across Italy that had been introduced by Augustus and continued under Tiberius, benefiting the lower classes. He also returned the election of magistrates to the people, which Tiberius had given over to the Senate as per Augustus's wishes. He held lavish games, going so far as to have the floor removed from the scepter and flooding it so naval battles could be staged. Given the popularity of his policies early on, the Senate granted him a number of honors, including giving the first day of his reign the title of Perilla, which had come to be associated with the founding of Rome. Tiberius died, leaving a particularly healthy imperial treasury, which Caligula made full use of during his tenure. Banquets in Rome were customary among the upper class and were used as a method of displaying wealth and taste, as well as affording appropriate status to the attendees amongst their peers via their positions on the banqueting couches. However, Caligula, who had no precedent from either Tiberius or Augustus on how formal imperial banquets should proceed, flouted the wealth of the empire, holding a string of opulent banquets where tradition was pushed aside in order to give his favorites, including his sisters, positions of honor around the table. It is said that at one of these banquets, he drank vinegar in which pearls had been dissolved, and that food would be served covered in gold leaf in outrageous displays of wealth. In another affront to tradition, and despite the earlier warnings of Macro about etiquette, Caligula invited guests that many would deem unsuitable, such as the charioteer Eutychus, whom he gifted with 2 million sesterces. But despite his affront to tradition early in his rule, it was still deemed an honor to be invited to Caligula's banquets. His spending didn't stop at banquets. Caligula himself was a great fan of gladiatorial games and theatrical performances. He frequented the Circus Maximus, spending much time with the team of the Green faction, but would also spend time in the company of actors and mimes. One mime in particular, Monaster, would later be called Caligula's lover, given the amount of time they spent in each other's company. Rules surrounding entertainment were relaxed, and under Caligula, men of the aristocracy of Rome acted in the performances, something that had been prohibited under his predecessors. The frequency of games and performances increased dramatically during his rule, whereas they had been hugely scaled back under Tiberius. It seems that Caligula, with his own love of popular entertainments, indulged at every opportunity. He was even known to train and fight with gladiators. He also extended the Saturnalia festival to 5 days. However, as much of the entertainment was provided by elected praetors, it was the senatorial class who came under the burden of most of the expenses, rather than the emperor. As well as lavish entertainment, Caligula embarked on both public and private building projects, which had been much curtailed under Tiberius, although most would be unfinished by the time of his death. Of the public buildings he began were an amphitheatre, the Aqua Claudia and Annio Novus aqueducts, and a harbour at Rhegium, as well as dedicating the theatre of Pompey, which alongside the construction of the Temple of Augustus had been in the process of renovation under Tiberius. But he also wasn't afraid to build for his own pleasure either. On the Vatican Hill, he built his own stadium for chariot racing, now known as the Gaium, and began extensive extensions to the palace on the Palatine. On June 10, 38 AD, Drusilla, Caligula's favorite sister, died unexpectedly. His grief was immense, and when she was granted a public funeral, he was unable to attend due to the depth of his grief, her eulogy instead being delivered by her husband Lepidus. Caligula left Rome, first making for his villa at Alba before traveling to Campania and then to Sicily, all the while letting his hair and beard go uncut as a sign of his grief. A period of mourning for her was decreed and observed in Rome and other parts of the empire, such as Egypt. Those that didn't observe the mourning period may have risked conviction, as well as receiving the same honors as Livia after death, whose own mourning period was not subject to suspension of business. She was revered by the Senate, and a statue was erected to her in the Temple of Venus. She was also to receive her own temple and college of priests. She was to be part of the oaths, sworn by any woman, and was to be known throughout the cities of the empire as Panthea or All-Goddess. Caligula even bowed to the flattery of one who announced he had seen Drusilla ascend to the heavens and should be struck down if he was lying, to which Caligula rewarded him with a handsome sum. Elaborate 2-day games were to be held for her, each year on her birthday following her death. These honors, although many were not extraordinary in themselves, were significant only because they went to a woman who was of so little political consequence. In the months following Drusilla's death and his return to Rome, Caligula married for the 3rd time. Although the exact date is unknown, his wife, Lolia Paulina, was a woman of immense wealth through inheritance who, at one of the more modest banquets, supposedly wore jewels worth 40 million sesterces. When Caligula first sought her as a bride, she was already married to the governor of Moesia, Macedonia, and Achaia, Publius Memmius Regulus, a man of more modest means. He agreed to divorce his wife and supposedly gave her in marriage to Caligula himself. Towards the end of 38 AD, Caligula granted further territories, this time to the Thracian princess Rumatelsis, Polymon II, and Cotys, whom he had known since his time in Antonia's household. They were granted Thrace, Pontus, and Lesser Armenia, respectively, which had been under Roman governance since the death of their mother, Cotys, king of Thrace, in 1980. It was around the same time that the governor of Egypt, Aulus Alvilius Flaccus, was recalled and arrested, although the exact charges are unknown. Throughout the year, there had been unrest in Alexandria between the Greeks and Jews, but tensions diffused somewhat with the removal of the governor. Flaccus was condemned to exile and had his property confiscated. Lepidus, however, intervened and ensured a more comfortable exile than had been intended. Caligula began his second consulship on January 1st, 39th AD, alongside Lucius Apronius Sicinus. While Apronius completed the 6-month term, Caligula resigned the position after only 30 days, whereby he was replaced by Sanguinius Maximus. But it was in 39 AD that things started to change. Although the sources are vague for the months following Caligula's resignation from the consulship, a conspiracy involving former consuls against the emperor was discovered. The cases went through the court, and the conspirators were condemned under maiestas. Although we are not provided with their names, a number of others were then tried for corruption, for the misuse of funds relating to road repairs, stretching back into Tiberius's reign. 5 other trials of senators are recorded for the time, including that of Seneca, of which 3 resulted in death or suicide. Only Seneca and the orator Domitius Afer escaped condemnation. However, the wholesale slaughter of the senators by Caligula at this time has been dismissed for lack of evidence in modern interpretations of the available sources. Caligula wasn't finished with the maiestas, though, and addressed the Senate, where he denounced their treatment of Tiberius and placed the blame on them rather than the former emperor for the many deaths that had accompanied the maiestas trials in the last years of his reign. Information on the individuals that had fallen victim to the trials was recounted, and here Caligula revealed his hand, as much of what was spoken came from the documents that were supposed to have been burned. He went on rebuking the Senate for the hypocrisy in the way in which they spoke to him, presenting him with honors and then conspiring behind his back. At the end of his speech, he reinstated the maiestas trials and left the Senate, having made his position as ruler clear. The following day, the Senate responded in the only way they could, praising him as a pious, sincere ruler, voting that annual sacrifices should be offered in lieu of his clemency on the anniversary of his speech, and granting him an ovation, practicing the same flattery Caligula had criticized them for, and so it would continue for a time. Caligula now began to exploit the tradition of friendship that existed between members of the aristocracy. The Senate were under no illusion. His speech had made it clear what the emperor thought of them. But Caligula held the power, and for the moment at least, They had no choice but to comply. A resolution was passed through the Senate, whereby all those that had named Tiberius in their will must now change it to name Caligula instead. But this wasn't all. Caligula gave large sums as gifts to force the recipients to make even larger gifts to him, which in some cases forced people into debt. Furthermore, when Caligula put his own gladiators up for auction, his presence at the event caused their prices to rise, as those present felt obliged to bid. He is even said to have caused Aponius Saturninus to bid 9 million sesterces for 13 gladiators, when Caligula drew the auctioneer's attention to the man nodding in his sleep, which was taken to mean he was bidding. One of the most notorious acts for which Caligula is known is wanting to make his horse a consul, and both ancient and modern historians have used this example to highlight his supposed insanity. But there is another explanation. Following the discovery of the conspiracy, Caligula had not been shy in expressing his feelings towards the members of the Senate, and thus far had employed fiscal humiliation tactics. He is said to have invited his favorite racehorse, Incitatus, to banquets where he would eat food made of gold and was served with golden dinner services. But Caligula was also supposed to have had a fine marble stall constructed for him, a manger of ivory to hold his food, and purple blankets before being given a palace staff and a dinner service so that he could entertain guests in the proper way by presenting Incitatus with the accoutrements. Caligula was made a consul, making a joke at the expense of the aristocracy, while also showing that power lay with him, and ultimately he would appoint whom he liked to be consul. At the same time, although the date is uncertain, Caligula ended his third marriage, divorcing his wife Lollia. He stated the reason was that she was barren. However, keeping with their negative narrative, the sources claim this was just an excuse, and that he was, in fact, tired of her. Later accounts from Claudius's reign give credence to Lollia's infertility. A short time later, during the summer of 39 AD, a child named Julia Drusilla was born to Melonia Caesonia, a woman of proven fertility, who already had 3 daughters. Caligula married Melonia following the birth, possibly on the same day, although once again the timeline is uncertain. Melonia was already pregnant by the time Caligula divorced Lollia, and while there isn't any question that Caligula was the father, he reportedly carried the child to the Capitoline temple and placed her on the statue of Jupiter, confirming her paternity, and then on that of Minerva, giving her education over to the goddess. Caligula also used the opportunity of Julia's birth to discuss the expenses of being a father, which forced members of the aristocracy to offer monetary gifts or risk a public demonstration of their lack of friendship to the emperor. Throughout the first half of the year, planning was underway for a campaign in Germany, including the raising of 2 new legions. But at the same time, another plot against Caligula was being developed. Among the conspirators were Lepidus and, both of the emperor's sisters, having been all but excluded from the succession with the birth of Caligula's child. The commander of Upper Germany, Gaius Tullius, who had held his position since 29 AD, as well as the Suffolk consuls, were also involved, and it is said that the plot was known by many within the Senate. The plot was betrayed, although it is unknown by whom, but not all of the conspirators were immediately unmasked. Caligula moved first against the consuls, removing them from office and having their fasces, or rods of office, broken. This led to one of the unnamed consuls committing suicide, and Dimmius Arthur and Aulus Didius Gallus were appointed by Caligula to replace the disgraced consuls. It is likely around this time that Caligula also decided to divide the province of Africa in 2 and remove the last legion stationed there from the control of the Senate, with command passing from the senatorial position of proconsul to the control of an imperial legate, thus restricting senatorial military commands. He then travelled to Umbria, but stayed only a short while, and going against the planning for the campaign, started without warning the journey to Germany at an unrelenting pace, his sisters and Lepidus among the retinue. Although the sources are somewhat unreliable, recent attempts have been made to produce a coherent account of the events surrounding the conspiracy and campaign. It has been suggested that Caligula, suspecting Italicus, left Umbria without warning in order to surprise the commander, thereby giving him no time to prepare to stand against him. Gaius Tullius was executed and replaced by General Galba. At the same time, his sisters and Lepidus's complicity came to light. Lepidus was executed, and both sisters were exiled, He paid the soldiers for their loyalty and supposedly sent the swords that were to have been used against him back to Rome, to be offered in the temple of Mars Ultor. He informed the Senate by letter of the plot and forbade the granting of any future honors to his relatives. A number of trials also took place for members of the Senate who had links to the conspirators involved in the plot, and others, such as the future Emperor Vespasian, were forced to denounce the actions of those involved. As with the first conspiracy, earlier that year, the Senate granted an ovation for Caligula, but this backfired on them when they chose Claudius to lead the delegation that set out to deliver the news, as their choice went directly against Caligula's prohibition of honors for his family. Most of the delegation were dismissed back to Rome before reaching the emperor, and only a few, including Claudius, were allowed to attend him, although not without hostility on Caligula's part. Following this mistake by the Senate, Caligula then forbade them to grant any future honors to him. Under Gaius Tullius, the army had become lax and had failed to halt German incursions into Gaul. Now it fell to Caligula to correct things. He reduced the amount paid on completion of service and discharged many centurions due to their age and poor physical condition. Dishonorable discharges went to a number of commanders who, when redeployed to Germany, were thought to have delayed matters waiting on the outcome of the conspiracy. Galba was rewarded for his loyalty with a commendation and the task of restoring the army of the Upper Rhine to an effective force. Similarly, the commander of the Lower Rhine army, Apronius, was replaced by Publius Gabinius Secundus due to his familial connections with Gaius Tullius and a record of defeats. Given the lateness of the season, little in the way of actual military campaign took place at the end of 39 AD. However, those small engagements that did take place resulted in victory for the Roman army. Galba was successful in pushing back the enemy, and Vespasian put a proposal to the Senate to hold games celebrating Caligula's victory in Germany. Caligula wintered in Lyon, where it appears he took account of the tax rolls. Dio suggests that, to pay for the campaign, he ordered that the richer inhabitants of Gaul be executed and their wealth confiscated. However, this scenario is likely another attempt by an ancient historian to distort the interpretation of the situation to suit his own bias against Caligula. It is known that at this time, Caligula auctioned off the entirety of his sister's households. He then went further, ordering that many of the valuable possessions accumulated under Augustus and Tiberius throughout the imperial household should also be auctioned in Gaul, serving to raise Caligula's profile by allowing those in Gaul to acquire objects connected with the prestige of Rome. The town of Lyon gained from the emperor's visit, as it benefited from games and theatrical performances put on at Caligula's expense. While Lyon enjoyed the festivities provided by the emperor, the inhabitants of the nearby town of Vienna, modern-day Vienne, France, were granted Roman citizenship. At the beginning of 40 AD, Caligula took up his third consulship, but given his absence from Rome, the Senate, fearing recriminations for acting on his behalf, delayed all business until they heard from him. On January 12th, they received word from the emperor that he was resigning the consulship. Business commenced with sacrifices to Caligula in the temple on the Capitol and prostrations before the empty throne. Then, in the Curia, the senators offered praise and prayers for the young emperor. Shortly after the new consuls had taken up their positions, another letter arrived from Caligula, which led to the dedication and erection of statues for both the emperor and Drusilla. The events early in 40 AD are still subject to much debate, as no definitive answers can be gleaned from the sources. Rather than setting out to conquer further Germanic territory, the campaign on the Rhine continued in a defensive capacity, following Caligula's reorganization within the ranks under the leadership of Galba. Caligula then set out, supposedly with his sights set on an invasion of Britain. However, we cannot state with certainty that he intended to invade Britain at this time, given that the Rhine frontier, although in a better position than it had been under Gaius, was not yet secure. It has been suggested, on the one hand, that Caligula set out on a military procession from the Rhine towards the Channel, where on arrival he officially received the exiled Adminius from Britain and accepted his surrender. The order to collect seashells was given as part of the victory celebrations, and they were taken back to Rome and displayed as part of his triumph and a donative paid to the soldiers. On the other hand, there is a suggestion that the legions mutinied on the shore, refusing to make the crossing to Britain, and they were then ordered to collect shells as a humiliating punishment. Given the lack of details and the biased nature of the sources, these suggestions are the more plausible among the many proposed, but neither can be proved with certainty. Caligula then turned back for Rome and was met partway by a delegation from the Senate, who urged him to hurry back to the capital, perhaps in no small part caused by the foil conspiracy. His feelings towards the Senate had not improved, and he is purported to have uttered words to the effect that he was coming back, tapping the hilt of his sword. Going further still, he forbade the Senate from coming out to meet him on his return to the city. Around this point, there was also a change in those he surrounded himself with. Now, only in public would he still be accompanied by members of the Senate and aristocracy as a whole. His wife and both praetorian prefects were among his confidants, but he now chose freedmen such as Callistus and Protogenes, and the slave Helicon over senators as part of his inner circle, further severing relations with them. On the way to Rome, it is likely that Caligula met with the client King Ptolemy of Mauritania, having been summoned by the emperor while he was absent. Ptolemy was arrested and imprisoned in Rome for a time before being executed. A number of reasons have been put forward for the execution. One is that Caligula took offense at the purple robes he wore. Another is that Caligula wanted Ptolemy's wealth, or perhaps Ptolemy had in some way been involved in the plot against the emperor through a familial association with Gaius. However, as with so much of Caligula's reign, no one reason can be stated with any certainty, if any are true at all. While it seems that Ptolemy had not been hugely favored amongst his people, his execution did spark a revolt by his loyal elements, which was not fully put down until 42 AD under Claudius. Caligula didn't enter the city immediately on his return. It may have been at this time in the gardens of Agrippina, where he met with the Jewish delegation led by Philo from Alexandria for the first time following the riots between them and the Alexandrian Greeks. Although the timeline cannot be irrefutably confirmed, partly out of concerns for his own safety amid a crowd, and because he had forbidden honors from the Senate precluding a triumph, he turned from Rome and made his way south to his villa near Puteoli, modern-day Pozzuoli, where he planned to stage his triumphant return by crossing the sea. Cargo ships were gathered from far and wide and set up in a double row across the 3-mile span of the Gulf of Baiae from Puteoli to Baiae, and were piled with earth to form a solid crossing. Caligula, supposedly wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, made sacrifices to the gods and crossed the bridge from Baiae accompanied by his troops. The following day, he made the return crossing, this time bringing a train of plundered items with him, presumably from the north, as well as his friends of the aristocracy, troops and praetorians. Supposedly, they dined on a stage at the center of the bridge. The celebration ended with many being thrown into the water, while the bridge itself was attacked by shipborne rams, with much of it being sunk. Some of those that went into the water drowned, but others managed to pull themselves to safety. There is uncertainty surrounding the exact date of the event. Many historians place it in a dance with Dio's account of 39 AD before Caligula journeyed to the Rhine frontier, but others, based on the accounts of Josephus and Seneca, place it a year later. Following Caligula's return from the north, Caligula finally returned to Rome on August 31st, 40 AD, his 28th birthday, and received innovation. A number of trials were instigated, some of which fell under maestas. Julius Canis, a Stoic philosopher, was sentenced to death, likely by the Senate, for a possible connection to a conspiracy. Although for some, such as the orator Julius Gracchus, the reasons for trial and subsequent execution cannot be determined, and few actual cases are named, despite the assertion of the sources that Caligula was planning to eliminate much of the Senate. The senators themselves once again began denouncing one another, but not all of the trials resulted in executions. When the senator Pomponius was accused by another, possibly of maestas, his accuser called the freedwoman Quintilia as a witness. Despite being tortured by the Praetorian tribune Cassius Carus, she refused to reveal any information, damning or exonerating alike. When brought before Caligula, following her ordeal, he was touched by the lasting disfigurement inflicted upon her, and released both Quintilia and Pomponius, rewarding the freedwoman with 800,000 sesterces. As denunciations continued, in a bid to prove loyalty to the emperor, a third conspiracy came into being involving members of the aristocracy. The son of a former consul, Sextus Papinius Batilionis Bassus, and an imperial quaestor, along with a third unnamed senator, was seized and executed after their plot was betrayed by the senator Anicius Cerealis, who would meet his own end under the Emperor Nero. Caligula then exploited the feeling in the Senate following the discovery of the latest plot and, in the next session, granted impunity to the remaining members, as there were few now. But he was still ill-disposed towards them, and as likely intended, his words caused further fear among the senators, for Caligula hadn't named those who still attracted his ire. This led to bloodshed in a later session. Caligula didn't attend the session, but Protogenes, the man tasked with keeping records on the senators, did. When the senator Scribonius Proculus greeted him, Protogenes is reported to have replied with sharp words about the man's hatred for the emperor, which provoked a response from the other senators. They set upon Proculus, and he was reportedly torn apart, with his remains presented to Caligula, for which he was reported to have shown pleasure. Following the death of Proculus, Caligula declared his reconciliation with the senators, who in Ion Sion turn voted festivals in his favor, and issued a decree that he should sit on a high platform, kept away from those who would approach him, and would be allowed a military guard within the Senate. Now Caligula turned to a tactic of subjugation, however, and permitted slaves to bring charges against their masters. So not only did the leading men of Rome have to guard their tongues in public, lest they be denounced, but now even their homes weren't safe from scrutiny. As a consequence, Claudius soon found himself denounced by one of his slaves and faced a trial, although it is reported by Josephus that Caligula hoped for his uncle's execution, a statement which cannot be proven either way. The trial was dismissed, without influence from the emperor. One of the more notorious stories of Caligula is his opening of a brothel on the Palatine, although we are not presented with a date for this apparent act. However, it has now been suggested that this was yet another way in which Caligula checked the behavior of the senators, and, far from being a brothel, was actually an extension of familiares, the custom whereby favored members of the aristocracy lived within the palace. In this instance, those women and children who were supposed to have been the prostitutes have been suggested to be the wives and children of those highest-ranking consuls who were, in a way, hostages to the emperor, their husbands and fathers, thus compelled to repay the emperor with gifts for the honor bestowed on the family and a vow to the supposed friendship between them. Other, more overt attacks on the Senate now commenced, from which no one was immune. Caligula abolished the reserved seating for Senate and equestrians alike at theatrical performances, leading to competition for seats which could become violent and forcing them to mix with plebs in the audience, demeaning their status. Claudius again was met with hostility when his vote in the Senate was demoted within the ranks, so that he would be the last to vote in all matters, not dissimilar to the treatment of Silanus years earlier. But going further, Caligula targeted those old republican families and decreed that their statues should be taken down from the Campus Martius, and only he could decide whose statues and portraits were displayed. Those descendants of famous republicans were also now denied the honors attached to their family, including that of a great-grandson of Pompey, who was forbidden from using the title of the Great within his name. The humiliation continued further still. Caligula took to offering his hand or foot to be kissed by members of the Senate and failed to return the gesture, disdaining the symbolism of equality between them. Many times he would make the gesture to those of lower standing, snubbing the well-respected and higher members completely. And yet, those that did receive public favor in this way still continued to offer their thanks openly. Sometime in mid to late 40 AD, following further unrest in the east, this time in Judea, Caligula announced that the imperial cult and a statue of himself should be set up in the Temple of Jerusalem, a move which has often been cited as evidence for his thinking that he was a god. This act, in fact, was more likely in response to the destruction of an imperial altar at Jamnia by the Jews during the unrest. There is no evidence that Caligula actually considered himself a god. Since Augustus's time, the Senate had often referred to the emperors as divine as part of their praise for deeds, and both Augustus and Tiberius frequently refused such honors heaped upon them. The same is true of the earlier part of Caligula's reign. It is only following the conspiracies, when his attitude towards the Senate changed, that Caligula permitted this type of veneration to himself. It has been suggested that it was yet another tactic he employed to humiliate the Senate, demonstrating their submissiveness rather than an official cult of worship. The imperial cult in the provinces was an important reflection of provincial loyalty to Rome rather than a cult dedicated to the worship of the current emperor. Although divine ruler cults existed elsewhere and had been prominent in the Hellenic regions, again, there is no suggestion that Caligula styled himself in this way. While he was known to have dressed as a number of gods and goddesses occasionally in public, these should not be seen as his wish to be worshipped, but instead as his attempt to publicly expose the hypocrisy of the Senate by their veneration of him. By January of 41 AD, Caligula had finalized plans for an extended visit to Alexandria. There is also a suggestion that he may have been planning to eventually move the capital to the city. Since the discovery of the third conspiracy, Caligula's distrust among those in his inner circle had grown. Indeed, Bassus's father, Capito, had denounced those aristocrats with whom he still had associations, as well as his own aides, as part of the conspiracy before he was executed. The denunciations were dismissed, but the seeds of suspicion had been sown in Caligula. Despite the protestations of his freedman Callistus and the praetorian prefects that they were loyal, Caligula was not convinced, and this placed them in danger. Callistus and the prefects couldn't be the ones to assassinate Caligula themselves, but as fear of possible future reprisals spread through the upper echelons of the praetorians, Cassius Chaerea, a praetorian tribune who had more contact with the emperor than most, having been given the distasteful tasks of tax collection and torture, and frequently made the butt of the emperor's jokes, is suggested to have proposed Caligula's assassination. The plot then fell into place. Chaerea seemed eager to see it done, and brought another tribune, Cornelius Sabinus, on site. However, he was repeatedly put off from acting by the prefect Clemens, but finally, the date was set for January 24th. Caligula's departure for Alexandria was scheduled for the 25th. Caligula spent the morning in the theatre, opening the performance, with a sacrifice to Augustus before returning to the palace. Later in the day, separated from his entourage that had accompanied him from the theatre, Caligula was now flanked by the two tribunes. There are several differing accounts of the murder, but most agree that it was Chaerea who struck the first blow before the emperor was set upon by Sabinus and a number of centurions. Caligula's death was immediately followed by that of his wife and child, at the hands of a tribune by the name of Lupus. In the immediate aftermath of his death, a number of conspirators were killed by members of the imperial Germanic bodyguard within the palace, while a search was instigated for others. The spectators in the theatre were horrified at the news of the attack on the emperor, and rumors were rife, some stating that the emperor wasn't dead at all. Only a short while later was it confirmed by Arrentius Varus that Caligula was indeed dead, which quelled the Germanic bodyguard who'd surrounded the theatre, allowing the spectators to leave. Arguments ensued over the future of the empire among the Senate, some going as far as to seek the restoration of the Republic. But the following day, the decision was taken out of their hands when the praetorian prefect declared Claudius as emperor, and soon the Senate followed suit, confirming him in his position. With the exception of Sabinus, who committed suicide, all the remaining assassins were then executed. Caligula has been seen for many years as a mad and lustful emperor, but increasingly modern historians have re-evaluated the available primary sources and now suggest that many of the accounts were hostile towards him, painting a picture of an insane, tyrannical monster unfit to rule in their eyes, muddling his deeds and projecting bad qualities of later emperors onto him to suit their purpose rather than giving a true recounting of his short rule, thereby biasing our own narratives of him. A prime example of this can be seen during Caligula's time in Germany. Suetonius's accounts of the later emperors Galba and Vespasian point to small victories in Germany during the closing stages of 39 AD, but his writings on Caligula, which completely fail to mention the foiled conspiracy, distort his actions in the region, painting a farcical picture of his time there, rather than that of an emperor attempting to right a situation that had developed over the last decade. Similarly, it has been well stated that having been left a healthy treasury by Tiberius, Caligula bankrupted the empire. However, In-depth modern examinations of fiscal activities during his reign suggest that he, in fact, promoted sound economic policy and left the treasury in good condition despite his lavish spending. As well as this, for many years, the narrative of Caligula's incest with his three sisters has been propagated and is still thought of as true by a minority of historians today. But it is only in some of the later accounts, such as Suetonius, rather than those of his contemporaries, that this accusation is made. Similarly, in an account of his sister Agrippina by Tacitus, while he posits that she may have attempted incest with Nero, nothing is mentioned of Caligula. Nero, later known as Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, entered this world as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, 37 AD, at the imperial villa in the Italian town of Antium. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was born sometime around 2-1 BC to the prominent Ahenobarbi clan. Originally of the plebeian class, the family was raised to ruling patrician status under Augustus and had produced many consuls, the highest elected political office in the Roman Republic. Gnaeus Domitius held the consulship in 32 AD for the entire year. However, 4 years later, after a fire tore through the Aventine and Circus Maximus in Rome, the Emperor Tiberius appointed him to serve on a commission set up to compensate those who had lost their property to the blaze. In the closing months of Tiberius's reign, Gnaeus Domitius found himself accused of incest with his sister Domitia Lepida and of adultery with the noblewoman Albusilla in proceedings brought about by the Praetorian prefect Macro. But with Tiberius's death and the smooth succession of Caligula, Domitius escaped prosecution. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the daughter of the elder Vipsania Agrippina, mother also of the Emperor Caligula. As such, Agrippina the Younger was also the great-granddaughter of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. Agrippina's father was the prominent Roman general Germanicus and a member of both the Julian and Claudian clans, so Agrippina had a distinguished ancestry. She was born on November 6, 15th AD, in the Rhineland settlement of Ara Ubiorum during one of her father's Germanic campaigns. In 28 AD, when the Emperor Tiberius returned to the mainland after his withdrawal to Caprae, today's island of Capri, he arranged for the 13-year-old Agrippina to marry Domitius Ahenobarbus. Their first and only child, Nero, would be born 9 years later following Tiberius's death in 37 AD. Nero's birth was accompanied by mixed omens. The delivery was traumatic for Agrippina, as it was a breech birth. Contemporary philosopher Pliny the Elder noted that the only person to have been born in such a way who had ever made a success of their life was the Roman general Marcus Agrippa, a close friend of Augustus. But as Nero was finally delivered, it is said that before he touched the ground for the first time, he was touched by the rays of the sun. Yet despite this positive omen, his horoscope was unfavorable, and purportedly, one astrologer predicted that Nero would rule, but would kill his mother, to which she exclaimed, "Let him kill me, only let him rule." Nero was only 2 years old when he was parted from his mother in 39 AD after she was implicated in a plot against her brother Caligula. A number of leading men were executed in the wake of the conspiracy, whereas both Agrippina and her sister Livilla were sent into exile, Agrippina taking up residence on the island of Pontia, where her older brother had served his own exile. Initially, Nero stayed with his father, but Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus had been suffering from dropsy for a time, from which he died in January of 41 AD. Nero was sent to live with his aunt Domitia Lepida, mother of the soon-to-be empress Messalina, but despite her affections for the young boy, he was subjected to a Spartan life thanks to Caligula. When imposing exile on his sisters, Caligula had confiscated their property, and not content with that, when Nero's father died, he also took Nero's share of his inheritance. Nero stayed with his aunt for only a short time, as on January 24, 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated. Claudius became emperor the following day and quickly recalled both Agrippina and Livilla from exile, restoring their property to them. Following her return from exile, Agrippina took her son back from Domitia Lepida, appointing him appropriate tutors, placed under the supervision of the freedmen, former slaves, Beryllus and Anicetus, and began the search for a new husband, setting her sights first on the distinguished general Galba. However, Galba resisted her advances, and instead, she turned to the wealthy, older consular Passienus Crispus, who at the time was married to Domitia Lepida's older sister, Domitia the Elder. Unlike Galba, Passienus, already distinguished in himself, likely saw the merits of a marriage to the daughter of distinguished General Germanicus and married Agrippina sometime late in 41 AD. Holding the proconsulship of Asia in 42-43 AD and taking his second consulship in 44 AD, Passienus's success continued. But he would be dead by 47 AD, leaving his fortune to Agrippina. Some of the ancient sources claim that Agrippina murdered her husband after being made his heir, but whether there is any truth to the claim cannot be proven. The year of Passienus's death also marked the 800th year since the founding of Rome, and accordingly, Claudius held centennial games to mark the occasion. Both Claudius's son, Britannicus, and Nero appeared at the games, taking part in the Lusus Troiae equestrian event. But of the two, it was Nero who received the warmer reception. It has been suggested that this adulation was orchestrated by agents of Agrippina. It clearly had a negative effect on Claudius's wife Messalina, as did the rumor that she had sent assassins to kill the infant Nero, who was saved by a snake, the skin of which he would wear in a golden bracelet. Messalina had played her part alongside her husband Claudius in removing those perceived as rivals to his somewhat shaky claim to power, including Agrippina's sister Livilla, early in his reign. After returning to exile late in 41 AD, she was subsequently executed, and so it is thought that during the years since her return from exile, Agrippina kept her head down in order to avoid attracting Messalina's attention, so much so that her actions during 41-47 AD have gone largely unrecorded. Instead, Agrippina seemed to have worked in such a way to keep attention from herself while subtly building up Nero. The adulation for Nero garnered a hostile reaction from Messalina, but by this point, her attention was elsewhere as she was, engaged in an affair with the consul designate Gaius Silius. It was her later supposed bigamous marriage to the man in 48 AD that brought about her death and the end of the threat to Agrippina and Nero. Whether Agrippina truly had designs on Claudius during this period cannot be proven, but following the death of Messalina, she emerged as the favored candidate for marriage to Claudius among those put forward by his freedmen. Already in 48 AD, she had had a hand in Claudius's daughter, Claudia Octavia's betrothal to Lucius. Junius Silanus dissolved with the aim of having Nero marry her instead, but her own marriage would come first. Engaging the assistance of Vitellius, the long-standing friend and colleague of Claudius, the issue of their marriage was brought before the Senate. Unions between uncle and niece were considered incestuous by Roman standards. But Vitellius extolled the union, and the Senate voted to allow the marriage, and to the apparent joy of the people and Senate alike, Claudius gave his consent when he met the crowds in the forum, and supposedly they were married that same day, early in January 49 AD. The betrothal of Nero and Claudia Octavia quickly followed, as well as the recall of Seneca from exile. This was seen as a reversal of fortune for Seneca, who had been exiled some years earlier on the probable trumped-up charge of adultery with one of Claudius's relatives. Nero was formally adopted by his now stepfather Claudius in 50 AD, and in the following year, still only 13 years old, he took the toga virilis, or toga of manhood, in March of that year. But this wasn't the only honor bestowed upon him. In the same month, he was designated to hold the consulship in the year 56 AD, as well as being granted proconsular imperium, or special command, outside the city, and given the title of princeps juventutis, or first in order. At the same time as promoting the advancement of her son, Agrippina sought to isolate Claudius's natural son Britannicus and began systematically removing those tutors, confidants, and sympathizers that had surrounded the young man, as well as convincing Claudius to revert the office of Praetorian prefect to a single position with the appointment of Afranius Burrus. Nero's assumption of the toga virilis marked his step into a public career, and in the same year, he made his first appearance in the Senate, giving a speech of thanks to Claudius. In 52 AD, when Claudius was ill, Nero once again spoke in the Senate, making vows for the recovery of the aging emperor and promising to hold games should he recover. Then in 53 AD, he appeared before the Senate and Claudius to make petitions, some spoken in Greek, on behalf of towns and cities throughout the empire that required help to recover from disasters that had befallen them, as well as pleading the case for Rhodes to have their freedom returned, which Claudius had stripped in 44 AD. When Claudius left the city to attend the annual Latin festival, Nero was appointed as prefect of the city. But 53 AD also saw the culmination of Agrippina's master plan when Nero married Claudia Octavia, Claudius's daughter. As Nero by this time had been adopted by Claudius, before the marriage could take place, it was necessary for his daughter to be adopted into another family, as once again the union would otherwise have been considered incestuous. But after the formalities of adoption were completed, the marriage went ahead, and the games that Nero had promised for Claudius were celebrated following the ceremony. AD opened with ill omens when a comet appeared in the sky. Early in the year, charges of practicing magic and failure to control her slaves were brought against Domitia Lepida, possibly engineered by Agrippina, and so Nero's aunt was executed after Nero himself gave evidence against her. But hers was not the only prominent death that year, as on October 13th, it was announced that the Emperor Claudius had died. The exact nature of his death is unknown, but some sources suggest he was murdered either by Agrippina using poisoned mushrooms or by her allies to ensure Nero's succession. Although this cannot be conclusively proven, the lead-up to the announcement of Claudius's death saw feverish preparations to secure Nero's position. The Praetorian prefect Burrus had already returned from camp that morning to prepare the guard, and following the announcement, accompanied the 16-year-old Nero out of the palace where he was greeted by the Praetorians at the foot of the steps and hastily escorted to their camp at the Viminal Gate. In the camp, Nero gave a speech to the soldiers, prepared by Seneca, and was hailed as emperor, taking the name Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, before promising a generous gift for each man of the guard, matching the sum promised by Claudius on his own ascension. Nero was then escorted to the Senate where they granted him the tribunician power and proconsular imperium, although as with his predecessors, he initially declined the title of pater patriae, or father of the nation, only accepting it later in 56 AD. It was likely at this time that Seneca received the title of amicus principis, or friend of the princeps, while the freedmen Beryllus and Anicetus were rewarded with the positions of secretary for Greek correspondence and prefect of the Misenum fleet, respectively. It was expected that Claudius's will would be read at the Senate meeting, but it was suppressed, and while a lot of conjecture has been put forward, the contents remain a mystery. It's unknown whether Britannicus had in any way been named in the will. Claudius's funeral was an elaborate affair arranged by Agrippina, taking place 5 days after his death to allow for a period of lying in state before processing to the campus, Martius, and the funeral pyre. Nero gave the eulogy, the speech itself written again by Seneca, and a short period of mourning was declared. On October 19th, the day after the funeral, Nero went before the Senate and asked that Claudius be deified, which they granted, and preparations for the establishment of his cult and temple construction were made. Following the deification, Nero didn't hesitate to use the title Divi Filius, or son of a god. Agrippina was granted honors from the Senate, including the use of 2 lictors, or bodyguards, and made a priestess for Claudius's newly founded cult. For a time, she appeared on imperial coinage, both alone and in tandem with her son. She is purported to have been left to deal with much of the day-to-day running in the beginning of Nero's reign. Her son even went so far as to have Senate meetings held in the palace so that she could listen in on the proceedings, but she still had her eyes set on dealing with potential rivals. Although we cannot be completely certain that she played a part, a short time after Nero's ascension, Marcus Junius Silanus, governor of Asia and brother to the deceased Lucius Junius Silanus, was killed while at dinner, possibly by the equestrian procurator Sila and freedman Helius, though no one was held to account for the crime. By the end of the year, Claudius's loyal freedman Narcissus would also be dead. In his first years as emperor, Nero swiftly gained a reputation for generosity, sharing power with the Senate and ending closed-door political trials, though he would also pursue his own interests and largely left ruling up to 3 key advisors: his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, the prefect Burrus, and also his mother Agrippina. In 55 AD, however, Agrippina's face was taken off the coinage. Seneca had encouraged Nero's independence from his domineering mother, which prompted her to turn against him and promote her stepson Britannicus as the true heir to the throne. She also protested against Nero's affair with Poppaea Sabina, the wife of a friend. Although Nero had openly praised Claudius in his speech to the Senate, he made some efforts to distance himself from his adoptive father, repealing acts such as the requirement that quaestor designates public officials should fund games from their own pocket and reviving the Cincian law, so that advocates received no fee at all from defendants, rather than the 10,000 sesterces set by Claudius. Agrippina was aggrieved by these actions, but Nero was undeterred. He also began to emphasize links to his natural father, Domitius Ahenobarbus, asking the Senate that a statue be granted to him and having his birthday commemorated outside his house each year. As a further sign of tension between Nero and his mother, in 55 AD, he began an affair with a former slave, Claudia Acte, and threatened to divorce Octavia. While he didn't get that far, he did live openly with Claudia Acte, much to his mother's dismay. Supposedly, Nero was assisted in initially hiding his affair by Seneca, who recruited the prefect Serenus to pretend to be the woman's lover. While this may have worked in public, Agrippina knew better and was unable to contain herself from doling out abusive comments to the woman. But to further add to her anger, the former slave Pallas, who had long been her ally, was dismissed from his post by Nero. In that same year, Nero's adopted brother Britannicus died. Sources suggest that Nero had engaged the services of a poisoner, Locusta, after the emperor had become suspicious of Britannicus. Locusta was supposedly the same poisoner who had supplied the toxin to dispatch Claudius. Echoing Claudius's final hours, the poison was said to have been administered during a dinner party, and when it took effect, Nero announced that Britannicus was suffering from one of his epileptic seizures and would recover. But after being removed on a stretcher, he died and was hastily cremated the following day. The murder was supposedly prompted by Agrippina's threats to champion Britannicus over her own son when their relationship began to deteriorate. However, as with the charge of murder, neither can be conclusively proven. Despite ancient accounts agreeing on murder, modern skepticism surrounds the events. And as it is known that Britannicus did indeed suffer from epilepsy, it remains possible that he did in fact die as a result of his condition rather than foul play. Following Britannicus's death, Agrippina sought to shore up her position, finding an ally in his sister Claudia Octavia, as well as other wealthy and influential individuals, and those among the lower ranks of the praetorians, having earlier lost Burrus's support when she insulted him. But Nero realized what she was doing and sought to do the same, winning over the praetorians with an allotment of free grain. Nero went further still by banishing his mother from the palace on the pretext that her morning salutation or formal greeting was too disruptive. Agrippina moved to her grandmother Antonia's house on the Palatine. Then, in an effort to further isolate her from the guard, Nero reformed their duties, which culminated in Agrippina losing access to the guards assigned to her and those around the palace. The reforms, however, were made in such a way that they couldn't be seen to be directly targeting his mother, instead simply as making sure the praetorians were to be used purely for military purposes. As well as the praetorians, Nero also saw to it that Agrippina lost the use of the Germanic bodyguards assigned to her shortly after his accession, perhaps seizing the opportunity of Agrippina's estrangement from Nero, and with scores to settle, the ex-wife of Gaius Silius, Junia Silana, and Nero's aunt Domitia the Elder joined forces against her. Nero was still on good terms with his aunt, and it was one of her former slaves, the actor Paris, who supposedly presented charges to Nero of maestas, or crimes against the emperor, targeting Agrippina and Rubellius Plautus, Tiberius's great-grandson. Nero panicked and ordered the immediate execution of his mother, but Burrus agreed only if the charges against Agrippina could be proven, and so she was granted a hearing. Interrogated the following day by Burrus in the presence of Seneca and a number of freedmen as witnesses, Agrippina argued her case and was subsequently heard by Nero, who concluded the matter by dismissing the charges against her. While showing clemency to his mother, Nero was not so merciful to those who had acted against her, and Junia Silana was exiled while others were condemned to death. Away from the family turmoil and day-to-day ruling of the empire, much of which, certainly at this time, may have been designated to his advisors, Seneca and Burrus among them, Nero continued to indulge his love for the arts and sports, continuing with his daily lessons on the cithara, a type of lyre, as well as writing songs and learning poetry. While he was a great fan of chariot racing, he was not fond of gladiatorial combat, only forcing himself to watch the combatants as they fought to the death. At nights, he would go out into the streets in disguise, frequenting bars and causing trouble among his friends. Although perhaps harmless at first, these events would descend further into violence, and when the senator Julius Montanus apologized for unknowingly hitting Nero during one of the attacks, he was shamed to suicide, while another, Faustus Sulla, received the punishment of exile when Nero wrongly suspected him of trying to ambush him on another one of his jaunts. 56 AD saw a new piece of legislation come before the Senate looking at the rights of freedmen. It proposed that a law should be passed giving patrons the right to re-enslave disrespectful freedmen, which met with much support. However, they did consult Nero on the matter before voting. Nero, most likely guided by his advisors, wrote to the Senate suggesting that as freedmen played roles throughout society, their rights as a whole should not be diminished, but each individual case should be assessed on its own merits, which the Senate accepted. Nero held his second consulship in 57 AD and embarked on the expensive construction of an amphitheatre in the Campus Martius. The stone-built foundations were faced with marble, while the main structure was constructed of wood and shaded with a sky-blue awning decorated with stars. Construction projects were not his only target for spending, and ever willing to increase his support using his wealth. He made a gift of 400 sesterces to each citizen of Rome. In the following year, when he held his third consulship, complaints from farmers and those in the harbours about the indirect taxes collected by the publicani, or tax collectors, reached the emperor. Initially, Nero suggested abolishing all indirect taxes throughout the empire. However, it seems he was dissuaded from this action, and instead issued an edict to all the provincial governors and the urban praetor of Rome that all cases brought against the publicani were to be given priority. In another show of generosity, Nero also improved the lot of 3 senators who had fallen below the minimum wealth requirement for membership in the Senate, granting them each a generous gift, thereby satisfying the requirements. Perhaps in part because of his generosity and good standing with the Senate, they offered him the consulship for life, which he declined. It was in the same year that the notorious prosecutor, Suilius Rufus, faced charges relating to his activities as a prosecutor during Claudius's rule. Indeed, it was his string of prosecutions that prompted Gaius Silius to raise the issue of reviving the Cincian law, which banned defendants from paying orators to plead their case. Rufus argued his position in front of Nero, stating that what he had done had been on the orders of the late emperor, but Nero found no mention of any orders in Claudius's records. So, Rufus changed tack, arguing that the orders had come from Messalina. But this claim, while it wasn't challenged, didn't save him, and he was exiled. But of all the events in 58 AD, likely the one that occupied Nero the most was his infatuation with Poppaea Sabina, a noblewoman married to a member of the Roman aristocracy. Some sources suggest her marriage to a man called Otho was a sham to disguise their affair until such time as Nero could divorce Claudia Octavia. Whatever the truth of the matter, Otho was appointed as governor of Lusitania, located in present-day Portugal and Spain, where he was to remain until the end of Nero's rule, leaving Nero free to continue his affair with Poppaea. Nero's mother, Agrippina, strongly opposed the idea of divorce, which was frowned upon in Roman society. Angered by his mother's intransigence and in the belief that she was plotting to murder him, he ordered his mother to be killed. But killing his mother was not to prove easy. Nero employed the services of the freedman Anicetus, who was in charge of the Messinum fleet and also had a dislike for Agrippina. Supposedly, the first plan Anicetus devised involved a mechanism placed into the ceiling of Agrippina's room, which would loosen the supports and cause the ceiling to fall on her while she slept. However, it seems the plan was leaked and was scrapped. It was then that the idea of the trick boat was conceived that would sink with Agrippina on board. However, it should be noted that given the implausibility of such a craft, it is possible that there was some confusion in the ancient sources when describing the murder. The act was planned to take place during the festival of Minerva, while Nero was at the resort of Baiae, and to this end, feigning a wish for reconciliation, Nero invited Agrippina to join him, which she accepted, traveling by ship from Antium. On the night that Agrippina dined with Nero, he showed her much outward affection, and when the banquet was concluded, walked her down to the shore where the ship was waiting. Agrippina is said to have casually reclined on board with her friend, Acerronia, until the weighted canopy above them collapsed, killing another companion instantly. However, the crucial section failed to work. Even so, Agrippina and Acerronia ended up in the water, and when Acerronia called out for help, claiming to be Agrippina, she was quickly killed. Here the sources differ. In one account, Agrippina swam to shore unaided but injured, but in another, she swam to some fishing boats who took her to shore, and she made her way back to her villa at Bauli, where, feigning ignorance, she sent a messenger to her son reporting the terrible accident. Nero was horrified to discover she had survived the murder attempt on the boat and sent 3 men to her villa to kill her. Agrippina is said to have died looking her killers in the eye. Before the fatal blow, she was said to have bared her stomach and told her executioner to strike the womb that had borne Nero. Officially described as a traitor, she was denied a state funeral and was hastily cremated and buried in an unmarked grave at the age of 43. The incident damaged Nero's popularity, which he was never to recover. Supposedly haunted by his deed, Nero moved to Naples, where he sent a letter to the Senate written by Seneca, in which he outlined his complaint that Agrippina had sought to bring power to herself and subvert the loyalty of the praetorians, people, and Senate, and blamed her for the scandals of Claudius's reign, culminating in her attempt on Nero's own life following the accident on the ship. Far from condemning Nero, it seems that the Senate reacted with relief and sought to offer their gratitude at her undoing, including voting annual games to mark the festival of Minerva to celebrate the foiling of Agrippina's alleged conspiracy. Nero returned to Rome in June to scenes reminiscent of a triumph and proceeded to the capital, where sacrifices were made to the triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, as well as to Mars Ultor, symbolizing a victory over Rome's enemies. There seemed little ill feeling in Rome for Nero's deed, and the few instances, such as graffiti and a farce performed by Datus, were treated leniently. Those that had been exiled during Agrippina's time as Claudius's wife were allowed to return, and the ashes of Lollia Paulina, the wife of former Emperor Caligula, were returned to Italy and buried in a newly constructed tomb. Free from the restraint of his mother, Nero was now able to indulge his passions. He began spending extravagantly and giving public performances as a poet and lyre player, and encouraged members of the upper classes to take dancing lessons, although this was regarded as unseemly. The Gaianum, built by Caligula on the far side of Rome, was adapted so he could drive chariots away from public view. It has been suggested that this concession was advised by Seneca and Burrus to steer him away from openly pursuing his other interests, which were considered less masculine. However, it soon became known what Nero was doing, and crowds gathered to cheer on the young emperor. Perhaps buoyed by this apparent support, Nero instituted the Juvenalia, or Youth Games, to mark the shaving of his first beard, for which he had a private theatre constructed in gardens across the Tiber. Entrance to the games, which followed, the dedication ceremony in the Temple of Jupiter, where his shorn hair was gathered into a golden box and presented in the temple, was strictly by invitation only, so Nero could be assured of a warm reception for his performances of song, poetry, and the lyre. But Nero was not the only one to perform, as a number of the invited members of the nobility, men and women alike, also took to the stage. The same year, a group of equestrians was established who became the emperor's companions, known as the Augustiani, who would praise and applaud Nero's actions as they followed him. It may also be around the time of the Juvenalia that Nero's Ludi Maximi, a series of plays dedicated to the eternity of the empire, took place. It was at this event that tokens were thrown into the crowd which could be exchanged for a number of prizes, including jewels, slaves, horses, and in some instances, even houses. It's AD the year in which Nero held his fourth consulship, saw the establishment of more games, Greek in style, when the inaugural Neronian Games came into being, loosely modelled on those founded by Augustus in Greece after the victory at Actium. The festivities included recitations and music, as well as athletics competitions that, in keeping with Greek tradition, were performed naked. Although Nero didn't perform in the games himself, he was still awarded a number of first prizes for Latin poetry and rhetoric, only declining the prize for best performance on the lyre, instead placing it at the foot of a statue of Augustus as a mark of respect to the first emperor. Following the success of the games, construction of a large, public bathhouse and adjoining gymnasium began. But all was not well with Nero, and purportedly, in this year, as with the year of Claudius's death, a comet appeared in the sky. It's been suggested that Nero may also have suffered from a bout of ill health, raising the question of the succession. Such was the speculation that Nero felt obliged to exile Rubellius Plautus quietly to his estates in Asia Minor, seeing him as a rival given his descendancy from Augustus and Tiberius. Rome saw both victories and defeats in the same year, in Armenia and Britain. General Corbulo was successful in conquering the Armenian capital Artaxata, which led to the installation of the pro-Roman Tigranes as king of Armenia. But in Britain, there was a very different story. In the previous year, the king of the Iceni, a client ruler of the Romans, Prasutagus, died, naming Nero as co-heir along with his daughters in his will. However, in claiming the kingdom for the emperor, the heavy-handed tactics of the financial procurator Catus Decianus, in plundering the land and confiscating the weapons of the tribe, did not go down well with the widowed Queen Boudica, who tried to resist. But her efforts were futile and resulted in her being flogged and both her daughters being raped. Outraged by the conduct of the Romans, the Iceni made common cause with the Trinovantes tribe to the south, who had their own grievances against the Romans, uniting against them. With the governor Paulinus engaged against the Druids in Anglesey, Boudica defeated a special force which had been sent against them before marching on Camulodunum, sacking the town and removing the head of a statue of Claudius. From Camulodunum, they marched on to Londinium and then Verulamium, raiding both towns and putting many citizens to the sword. But in their fervour, the tribes wasted the opportunity to cut off the understrength Paulinus, who had returned ahead of the bulk of his main force, allowing him to join up with the men marching down from Anglesey. Despite being fewer in number, Paulinus now had the advantage and proceeded against Boudica's army. Unable to bring their numbers to bear against the Roman line, the tribes were pressed against the Roman shields, losing the advantage of the greater reach their swords provided, but putting them in range for the Roman short swords, designed for stabbing, to do their work. The tribal warriors fell in droves until their resolve broke, but they were hindered in their retreat by a line of wagons they had drawn up behind them, overconfident in their ability to prevail against the legionaries. Following the defeat, Boudica took poison to avoid falling into the hands of the Romans, and the legionaries subsequently took retribution on much of the area of eastern England that had been involved in the rebellion, causing a famine among the beleaguered communities. The freedman Polyclitus was sent to assess the situation in Britain, and soon Paulinus was replaced as governor. Archaeological evidence can be found in all three towns for the raids by Boudica's forces. However, the site of the final battle between the two armies has never been identified. In 62 AD, the way was now clear for Nero to divorce Claudia Octavia, as Burrus, who had always been staunchly opposed to the idea, had died. Nero rapidly pressed the case that Claudia Octavia had failed to provide him with an heir. However, as she had supplied the link to Augustus that legitimized his claim as emperor, and also given her personal popularity, the imperial bodyguard, Tigellinus suggested the removal of two figures who could be seen as rivals. Faustus Sulla, who was married to Claudia Antonia, Claudius's other daughter, and Rubellius Plautus, who were both already in exile, were summarily executed without trial, with Nero portraying them as agitators. In less than 2 weeks, Nero concluded his divorce and married the pregnant Poppaea. Demonstrations soon arose, however, when Claudia Octavia was exiled to Campania. To quell the growing unrest, Nero once again utilized the services of Anicetus, convincing him to confess to adultery with Claudia Octavia, which he did. For his services, he received a comfortable exile in Sardinia. Claudia Octavia, on the other hand, was transferred to the island of Pandataria and executed a few days later, her veins being opened to make it appear as a suicide. Having not produced an heir with Claudia Octavia, the birth of Nero and Poppeia's daughter Claudia in January 63 AD at the imperial villa in Antium was a joyous occasion for all. The Senate lavished honors upon both Poppaea and the infant, including the title of Augusta for both of them, and a great many of the senators, upon reaching the villa, were duly received into Claudia's presence. However, the happiness wasn't to last, as only a few months later their daughter died. Nero's outpouring of grief was only matched by the joy he had shown at her birth. Following Claudia's death, she was deified, but there were to be no more children for Nero and Poppaea. This same year, the gymnasium was said to have been struck by lightning and destroyed by fire, burning so hot that a bronze statue of Nero melted, although some placed this event in the previous year. By 64 AD, as the influence of Tigellinus and Poppaea grew, there was a feeling of discontentment among the nobles of Rome. But this didn't stop Nero from pressing ahead and taking the leap to make his debut artistic performance to the masses. However, he chose not to perform in Rome, instead selecting the former Greek colony of Naples, as he believed that those of Greek culture would appreciate his skills. It may have been due to his plans to perform that his Augustiani entourage was increased to 5,000 individuals. Demand to see his performance was huge, and so the event, which ran over several days, was held in an open-air arena rather than a theatre to accommodate all those who wished to see the emperor perform. Nero appeared for several days on end before. The performances were cut short by an earthquake, although it is said that Nero continued his act through the first tremor, not wishing to leave it unfinished. Only later that day, after the performers and audience had vacated the structure, did it collapse. Nero, unlike some, took this as a good omen and composed a poem giving thanks to the gods that no life was lost. Following his performance in Naples, Nero then planned to sail on to Greece, stopping at Beneventum, where he was presented with the news of the suicide of Decimus Junius Silanus Torquatus, brother to the deceased Marcus Junius Silanus. Nero had arranged for Torquatus to face charges of harboring imperial ambition before his departure for Naples. Upon receiving the news, Nero lamented that had Torquatus only forestalled his suicide in advance of condemnation, he would have been spared by Nero's own clemency. Nero now changed his mind about the trip to Greece, although no explicit reason was given. It has been suggested that growing suspicions in the young emperor, coupled with Torquatus's suicide, may have played a part. It was on his return to Rome when he first started thinking about making a trip to the east, in particular Egypt. When he reached the city, he assured the people that his trip wouldn't keep him away for long and everything would continue to operate as normal in his absence. Seeking to find the most favorable time for the journey, Nero ascended the Capitoline, the smallest of the hills of Rome, to venerate and make sacrifices to the gods, paying particular attention to Jupiter and Apollo. All seemed to be in his favor until he descended to the temple of Vesta and was overtaken by a seizure, which he interpreted as a poor omen from the guardian of the Roman people, and promptly cancelled the trip. Publicly, Nero gave the excuse for the cancellation that he couldn't bear to be away from his beloved people, and instigated lavish celebrations to demonstrate his feelings for his subjects, purportedly culminating in an orgy organized by Tigellinus and the mock marriage of Nero as the bride to freedman Pythagoras, which some among society considered to be an immoral excess. The overindulgence of the imperial court was soon to end, however, when on July 18, 64 AD, a fire started in the Campus Martius and quickly spread through the shops and stalls surrounding it. It wasn't long before the blaze, driven by the wind, was spreading up the Palatine Hill, engulfing everything in its path, soon overtaking Nero's palace. The emperor, however, wasn't in residence that night, but staying in Antium, and was only made aware of the fire in the early hours of the morning. When a messenger arrived to convey the news, Nero reacted immediately, riding for Rome. Rome had had a fire brigade since 21 BC, and when Nero finally arrived in the city, he set about organizing their efforts. To help the population, he opened up the buildings and temples on the field of Mars in his own gardens, providing a safe space for the survivors to rest, escape the flames, and tend to their wounds. Nero threw himself into the firefighting efforts for 6 days, until it seemed they had finally brought the situation under control. Exhausted, those who had fought the fire sought sleep, but it soon flared up again in the area of Tigellinus's property, raging for a further 3 days. Of the 14 districts of Rome, only 4 escaped the ravages of the fire, with 75% of the city destroyed. Popular legend claims Nero fiddled while Rome burned. However, although he did allegedly weep copiously and recite poetry at the disaster, if he had played an instrument, it would most likely have been one similar to a lyre. In the aftermath of the fire, despite Nero's efforts to bring in extra grain supplies and slash prices to provide the populace with much-needed food, he and his associates, including Tigellinus, were blamed for the blaze. In the days that followed, Nero went about the city to plan the rebuilding and issued a number of reforms to regulations in an attempt to make it a safer place. But suspicions grew when he took for himself a huge parcel of land on which his massive new palace, the 100-acre Domus Aurea, or Golden House, would be built. At the same time as planning for his new palace, in response to the difficulties in supplying Rome with much-needed grain, a canal was planned to be dug from the Avernus Lake to Ostia, but the work was later abandoned. Although it is unknown who instigated it, the blame for the fire was shifted onto the burgeoning sect of Christians, who refused to acknowledge the Roman gods, bringing the ire of the gods down on the city. The number of Christians killed is unknown, but they were subjected to cruel executions, such as wearing garments soaked in pitch and burned alive, as well as being torn apart by dogs or crucified. But there was another serious outcome of the fire. In 62 AD, shortly after his withdrawal, Seneca had been linked with the senator Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso in accusations laid against him by the informer Romanus. Seneca successfully rebutted the accusations, and little attention was paid to them going forward. Piso, however, nursed serious resentments against Nero while openly playing the role of his friend, and in the aftermath of the fire, with many seeing Nero as taking extravagant liberties in his proposed rebuilding of the city and his own residence, he began recruiting other disenchanted senators to his cause. Piso attempted to recruit Seneca, but was initially rebuffed, although seemingly not out of loyalty to the emperor. Seneca was purported to have only become involved when his nephew, Annius Lucanus, better known as the poet Lucan, joined the plot. At the same time, a small number of officers within the Praetorians, including the second prefect, Fenius Rufus, were also talking of conspiracy. The two groups met, but what discussions they had ended in stalemate, with neither able to act without the support of the other. But the decision was taken out of the hands of both sides by the freedwoman Epicurus, the lover of Lucan's father Aeneas Mela, when she tried unsuccessfully to recruit a captain of the Messinum fleet, Volusius Proculus, who betrayed her to Nero. Epicurus was held in custody as Nero was holidaying in Baiae, but fear of what would be said once she passed into the hands of Tigellinus prompted action by the conspirators. The initial plan of Piso murdering Nero as he visited his villa was rejected, likely out of fear that another would supplant him as a candidate for emperor with his absence from the city. The conspirators finally settled on the festival of Ceres in April 65 AD to eliminate Nero, with Piso thereafter to be taken to the Praetorian camp by the prefect Rufus to be hailed as emperor. But the plot was betrayed by one of the conspirators. Nero didn't hesitate in ordering the execution without trial of Piso, who for his part did not resist, committing suicide when the Praetorians sent to deal with him arrived at his door. But when it came to Seneca, there seems to have been some reluctance on the emperor's part, even after he was joined by Poppaea and Tigellinus, who both had reasons to wish for Seneca's death. Instead of ordering his execution, he sent the Praetorian tribune Silvanus, who was among the conspirators, to find out what he had to say. By the time Silvanus returned to Nero with Seneca's response, the situation had evolved. When Lucan's part in the conspiracy was revealed, Silvanus was sent back to Seneca with a warrant for either his arrest or suicide. Despite the tribune's delay in seeking the advice of Rufus on whether to present the warrant, he did go to Seneca in order to keep the Praetorians' complicity in the plot secret. On receiving the warrant, Seneca is supposed to have lamented that Nero murdered his mother and brother. Now he has nothing worse left to do than kill his foster father and mentor. Seneca's involvement in the plot is attested in various sources, but many modern historians view his involvement as unlikely. Of the approximately 40 conspirators, at least 17 received the death penalty, while others were pardoned or exiled. Rufus was beheaded and replaced in his position as prefect by Nymphidius Sabinus. For his part in revealing the conspiracy, the freedman Milicus was rewarded with wealth and the title of savior. One of those who died was Epicurus, who committed suicide to escape the torture she was subjected to. Now Nero turned on those who sought to vote him honors after the foiling of the conspiracy, and had his agents actively search out possible conspiracies against him. In the years that followed, both friends of the emperor and those who opposed him would face death. Among the victims would be Claudia Antonia, the last surviving child of Claudius, who was denounced and sentenced to death for a supposed part in the conspiracy after refusing Nero's offer of marriage. To add to Nero's woes, 65 AD also saw the death of his beloved wife Poppaea. It has long been said that in a fit of rage, Nero kicked the pregnant Poppaea to death after she chastised him for returning late from the races. There is nothing to suggest this is more than a malicious rumor. The likely true cause of her death is natural, as early into her pregnancy she miscarried and began hemorrhaging and couldn't be saved. Rejecting the traditional Roman rite of cremation, Nero instead chose to have Poppaea embalmed in the style of Egyptian royal women and delivered her eulogy himself. Nero married for the third time in 66 AD to Statilia Messalina, the widow of the consular Vestinus Atticus, who had been forced to commit suicide in the aftermath of the Piso conspiracy. In the same year, Nero finally embarked on his postponed trip to Greece. Making his feelings towards the Senate clear, Nero appointed the freedmen Helius and Polyclitus to manage affairs in his absence with assistance from the prefect Nymphidius. The thinned ranks of senators did not oppose his decision, and Nero and his huge entourage took their leave of the city in September. Sometime after Nero's arrival in Greece, he invited Corbulo to join him in Corinth in 67 AD, and the general duly accepted his offer. But instead of being welcomed by the emperor, he was met by a warrant for his suicide, likely for his connection to Vinicianus. Corbulo didn't resist and ended his life. Shortly after, the commanders of the Rhine armies, the brothers Rufus and Proculus Scribonius, who may have been in correspondence with Corbulo, received similar warrants and both committed suicide. Before leaving Rome, Nero had sent word ahead to the Greeks that he wished to participate in all of their festivals, and so the timetable was changed to accommodate the emperor. He spent his time traveling around the country performing at the various festivals and was awarded in the region of 1,800 prizes, even receiving a prize for his driving of a 10-horse chariot, which ended in an accident from which he was lucky to survive. However, supposedly still haunted by the memory of his mother and the avenging deities, the Furies, he refrained from visiting either Athens or Eleusis. It was during this trip that he met the slave Sporus, who was said to resemble his wife Poppaea so much that the boy was castrated and married to Nero. Calvia Crispinilla, a woman of noble birth, was placed in charge of Sporus's wardrobe, with instructions to dress him in only the finest clothing befitting of Poppaea, and to ensure his hair and makeup made him the very image of his deceased wife. His tour culminated in November 67 AD, with his giving Greece its freedom, in the sense that the entire province was released from the burden of taxes due to the empire. As a further gesture, Nero laid plans and dug the first shovelful of earth for the proposed canal through the Corinth Isthmus. However, as with the earlier Avernus Canal, the work was not to be completed, but Nero's actions in Greece were viewed as favoritism and proof of his Hellenic leanings, as well as making yet another show of his lavish spending habits, which only caused further resentment towards him. Aid not only witnessed Nero's achievements in Greece. However, trouble had been brewing in Judea and other areas of the Jewish diaspora during the previous year, including the massacre of a Roman garrison at Masada. Early in 67 AD, it descended into full-scale war following the murder of the Syrian governor. A new governor was installed, and Vespasian was put in command of 3 legions in order to quell the violence. Vespasian was successful in his campaigns, reaching Jerusalem in the summer of 68 AD, but victory would not be achieved until 2 years after Nero's death in 70 AD, with some resistance continuing in 73 AD. His visit to Greece was supposed to have lasted 2 years, but matters were declining in Rome. Helius attempted several times to persuade Nero to return to the imperial capital, but the emperor ignored him. It was only when he traveled to Greece to meet Nero in person that he was persuaded of the gravity of the ill feeling back in Rome, and at last agreed to return. But Nero still made time to enjoy a triumph in Naples, and again upon reaching Rome, where he drove Augustus's own triumphal chariot. However, he didn't remain in the city for long, and spent the spring of 68 AD in the Bay of Naples. His break was interrupted by news that the governor Gaius Julius Vindex, a Romanized Gaul, had rebelled and was raising an army of Gauls. It seems that the news did little to trouble him, and he delayed informing the Senate for some time. Again, he showed little concern when he finally met the Senate in a completed section of the Domus Aurea in the heart of Rome, preferring to discuss the engineering of his new palace rather than the rebellion. But more was to follow when on April 2nd, Galba proclaimed loyalty for the Senate instead of Nero and began building up his strength by recruiting a 2nd legion under his command. Quickly, he found support among other governors, including Otho, who was still in Lusitania. Nero's response was to name himself as sole suffect consul and instruct 3 legions on the Rhine to march on the rebels besieging Lugdunum, while those legions in Italy were sent north, dividing the forces between the defense of the River Po and sending some into Gaul. Nero supposedly considered accompanying the Italian legions, but not in a military capacity, instead having musical instruments loaded into wagons for the entertainment of the troops, as well as providing them with concubines who were to play the part of Amazon warriors at a safe distance from any battle. However, it seems he gave up on the idea. However, things quickly grew worse when the commander of the Rhine legions, Verginius, supposedly allied himself with Vindex. Although the alliance unraveled the next day when the legions slaughtered 20,000 of the Gauls, leading to Vindex's suicide, Verginius, despite being hailed as imperator repeatedly by his troops, refused to lead them into Italy, and instead wrote to the Senate to state his intention of waiting for their orders. As the weeks wore on, Nero seemed to have been planning to move a number of legions, and was making arrangements to travel to Alexandria to bring a large enough force back to act in the protection of Italy. But behind the scenes, Nymphidius was making his own plans for Nero's downfall in concert with an agent of Galba. An advance party was sent ahead to Alexandria, likely on the advice of Nymphidius, comprising many of Nero's freedmen and Germanic bodyguard, leaving only the praetorians under the prefect to guard the emperor. When he instructed them to escort him to Ostia, they refused. Nero went to bed that night still guarded, but waking in the night, he found both the praetorians and many of his servants gone. Finding the palace almost deserted, he fled with 2 freedmen, Phaon and Epaphroditus, and Sporus, making for Phaon's villa outside of Rome. Later that night, news reached the villa that Nero had been deposed in favor of Galba and declared a public enemy, facing the ancient punishment of being paraded through the streets naked and beaten to death with staves. Epaphroditus suggested suicide. At dawn on June 9th, Nero went outside the villa and, with Epaphroditus's help, stabbed himself through the throat just as soldiers arrived to take him into custody. Supposedly shortly before he died, he uttered the words, "What an artist dies here." His body was claimed by Claudia Acte and prepared by her and 2 of his nurses from childhood before being quietly cremated. His ashes were placed in the Domitian family tomb. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian line came to an end. But soon Rome would be plunged into turmoil with the civil war in the following year that has become known as the Year of the 4 Emperors. Nero's reign was divided into 2 parts by the ancient historians, the good and bad years, the turning point beginning with the death of Agrippina. Ascending to the principate at a young age, through the maneuvering of his mother, he was assisted in his rule extensively by his advisors. Much of what he did in these early years was undoubtedly influenced by Seneca and Burrus, and less by Agrippina as time went on. so it is difficult to truly assess Nero as an independent ruler in his own right. In the beginning, he was popular and enacted a number of reforms and decrees that benefited the people of the empire from all ranks. From the outset, he chose to work with the Senate and banned the much-feared maestas trials, which had caused the deaths of many. His love of the arts provided the grateful masses with popular entertainment, although gladiatorial combat was somewhat reduced in favor of the theatre and chariot races which Nero preferred. His building projects as well initially were to the benefit of all and included a market and the large public baths and gymnasium, as well as continuing with the construction of the Ostia harbour begun under Claudius. He also took steps to ensure the grain supply, although his canal project would be later abandoned. After the murder of his mother, followed by the loss of Burrus and the withdrawal of Seneca, those that were close to him were of a more malign influence, and the lavishness of his court was resented by many. Even more so after the fire for which he was blamed, when he claimed a huge parcel of land to build the 100-acre Domus Aurea Golden House Palace complex. Taxation for the rebuilding of Rome and the subsequent reform that allowed him to confiscate the wealth of those who hadn't made provision for him in their will only served to make him more unpopular. With the restraint of his former advisors gone, Nero was free to indulge his follies, and while others of the nobility took to the stage, many despised Nero for his assault on Roman virtues, although the prosecutions under Nero did not amount to the numbers seen under previous emperors in the later years. No one was safe as his suspicions deepened and took hold, even his old tutor Seneca, who had been held in high regard for years. Ultimately, Nero's Hellenic leanings and lavishness sealed his downfall when, after surviving 2 senatorial conspiracies, he was brought down by the very man he relied upon for his protection. This concludes part 2 of our gentle journey through the Roman Empire. In our final episode, we'll discover the rise of the Flavian dynasty with Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, as Rome finds new stability after years of chaos. Until then, may these ancient tales carry you peacefully into slumber. Sweet dreams, dear listener.